You ever seen a symbol that shouldn't exist anymore? The question came out slow and casual, but it cut through the low hum of conversation like a blade through canvas. And for a brief second, a few heads turned before the laughter drowned it out again. Fort Ridgeline was hosting a base familiarization day, a polished display of discipline and pride. Rangers moving with sharp precision across sunlit concrete, boots crunching lightly over gravel paths. The late afternoon heat shimmering off the motor pool as civilians and new recruits lingered near the mess hall entrance, watching the elite up close. And among them stood an old man who didn't quite belong. William Carter, dressed in a faded denim jacket and worn work boots, hands steady at his sides, posture relaxed but not careless, like someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything. And that alone was enough to draw attention. Staff Sergeant Logan Hayes noticed him first, or more precisely, noticed what didn't fit. The way Carter stood without the restless energy of a visitor, the way his eyes tracked movement not with curiosity but with quiet assessment. And Hayes, young, decorated, and absolutely certain of his place in the world, saw it as a challenge rather than a clue. He stepped closer with two other Rangers at his side, their uniforms crisp, their confidence louder than their voices. "You lost, sir?" Hayes asked. The word "sir" flattened into something closer to a joke, and a few nearby recruits chuckled, sensing the shift in tone, sensing entertainment. Carter turned his head just slightly, pale blue eyes meeting Hayes without urgency, without irritation, just a calm that didn't quite match the situation. "Just looking," he said, voice low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention but held it anyway. Hayes smirked, glancing back at his team. "This isn't a museum," he said, louder now, making sure others could hear. "We don't usually give tours to historians." More laughter, sharper this time, the kind that feeds on itself. And Hayes stepped in closer, invading space with deliberate ease, his gaze dropping, catching on something half hidden beneath Carter's sleeve, a dark line of ink peeking from weathered skin. "What's that?" he said, reaching before waiting for an answer, fingers brushing fabric, pulling the sleeve back just enough to expose it. A tattoo, faded but deliberate, a circle enclosing a single star, the lines worn by time but not erased. It looked simple, almost forgettable, the kind of design you'd pass over without a second thought unless you knew what you were looking at. And Hayes definitely did not. "That's it," he laughed, turning Carter's arm slightly so the others could see. "Man, I've seen better ink on a gas station sticker rack." The group around him reacted on cue, a ripple of amusement spreading through the small crowd, phones lowering, conversations pausing as the moment sharpened into something more focused, more pointed. Carter didn't pull his arm away, didn't flinch, didn't react at all beyond the faintest tightening of his jaw, as if something distant had stirred but not yet risen. "You even know what unit that is supposed to be?" Hayes pressed, voice louder now, feeding off the attention. "Or you just picked something that looked cool back in the day?" The words hung there, heavy with assumption, with dismissal, and somewhere near the edge of the gathering, a younger Ranger, Corporal Ethan Brooks, shifted his weight slightly, his eyes narrowing not at Hayes, but at the tattoo itself. Something about the symmetry, the proportions, the way the star sat perfectly centered inside the circle. It didn't feel random, it didn't feel decorative, it felt intentional. But before the thought could fully form, Hayes gave Carter's arm a light tap, almost playful, almost careless. "Come on, old man," he said. "What's the story?" And for the first time, Carter's gaze dropped to the symbol, not with embarrassment, not with defensiveness, but with recognition, like looking at a name carved into stone. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow heavier. "It's not a story," he said. "It's a list." The words landed, softer than expected, but they didn't disappear. They lingered, just long enough to create a thin crack in the laughter before it tried to close again. The laughter tried to come back, but it did not land the same way. Not after that word. List. It hung there like something unfinished, something that did not want to be explained. And for a moment, even the heat seemed to settle heavier on the concrete. Staff Sergeant Hayes tilted his head slightly, the smirk still on his face but thinner now, less certain. "A list of what?" he asked, his tone still sharp but no longer effortless. Carter did not answer right away, his eyes still resting on the faded ink. as if measuring whether the question deserved anything at all. Then he lifted his gaze back to Hayes, steady, unchanged. Names, he said simply. And that was all. No elaboration, no story, just a single word that carried more weight than it should have. One of the rangers behind Hayes let out a short laugh, trying to recover the rhythm. What? Like your buddies from back in the day, he said, but it sounded forced. Like he was stepping into a conversation that had already shifted without him noticing. Hayes exhaled through his nose, dismissing the hesitation, stepping forward again, reclaiming control. You are saying that little star circle thing is some kind of roster? He asked, gesturing loosely at the tattoo. Because I have been around long enough to know every active and retired unit patch worth knowing, and that is not one of them. He let the statement sit there, confident, absolute. The authority of someone who believed knowledge was complete because it was recent. Carter's expression did not change, but there was a faint movement in his shoulders, not quite a sigh, more like the settling of something old. It would not be, he replied, his voice calm, almost quiet enough to miss under the distant hum of generators and the faint clatter of equipment being moved across the yard. Hayes gave a short laugh, louder than before, pulling attention back toward himself. Right, he said. Because it is secret, I guess. One of those ghost stories nobody can verify. A few of the younger recruits smiled at that, relieved to have something familiar to react to. But near the edge of the group, Brooks did not smile. His eyes were fixed on the tattoo, not on the shape itself, but on the spacing, the subtle irregularities that did not look like mistakes but like intent. He had seen enough unit insignias in training briefings to recognize patterns, and this one did not follow any standard format, which should have made it meaningless, but instead it felt deliberate in a way he could not explain, like something designed for a very small group of people. Hayes shifted his stance and reached again, this time more deliberately, turning Carter's forearm outward so the late afternoon light hit the ink directly. You mind if we take a closer look at your list? He said, not waiting for permission, his fingers firm but not aggressive, just enough pressure to assert control. Carter allowed it, his arm steady, his posture unchanged, but his eyes drifted past Hayes now, not scanning the crowd, not searching, just watching, as if something else had already started moving beyond this moment. Brooks felt it before he understood it, that subtle change in atmosphere, the way the noise of the bass seemed to dull at the edges, like the world was pulling back just a fraction. He shifted again, glancing toward the main operations building across the yard, its glass doors reflecting the sun in sharp lines, and without fully realizing why, his hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing against his phone. Hayes was still talking, still building the moment for the people around him. You know what this looks like to me? He said, turning slightly so more of the onlookers could see. It looks like something a guy gets when he wants people to ask questions, but does not have real answers. A few heads nodded, the confidence returning in small waves. Carter finally pulled his arm back, not abruptly, just enough to break the contact, his sleeve falling back into place, the tattoo partially hidden again. And when he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried in a way that made the space feel smaller. You are right about one thing, he said, and Hayes paused, just for a fraction of a second, not expecting agreement. You would not recognize it, Carter continued, because it was never meant to be recognized. The words did not challenge, did not accuse, they simply stated a boundary, and that, more than anything, unsettled the balance Hayes had been trying to control. And across the yard, the glass doors of the operations building opened, unnoticed by most, but not by Brooks. The shift was subtle, almost invisible if you were not looking for it, but Corporal Brooks felt it in the same way you feel a storm before the clouds roll in, a quiet pressure building behind everything ordinary. His fingers closed around his phone now, not fully pulling it out yet, just holding it there as his eyes moved from Carter to the operations building across the yard. Something about the old man's words had landed wrong, not because they were dramatic, but because they were not. They carried no need to impress, no attempt to convince, and that kind of certainty did not come from guessing. Hayes did not notice the shift, or if he did, he ignored it, doubling down instead, stepping forward again with that same confident edge. Never meant to be recognized, he repeated, letting out a short laugh. That is convenient. He turned slightly toward the others, playing to the small audience that had gathered. You hear that? That is the best kind of story, right? One nobody can check. A few of the recruits smiled again, relieved to have something simple to latch onto, something that made sense in their world of clear ranks and documented units. Hayes looked back at Carter, narrowing his eyes slightly now, searching for something to push against. Let me guess, he said. Black Ops. Off the books, no records, just a handful of guys saving the world while nobody knows their names. His tone carried a hint of mock admiration, exaggerated just enough to underline the disbelief beneath it. Carter did not respond. His gaze had shifted again, not toward Hayes, not toward the crowd, but somewhere beyond them, as if he were tracking something none of them could see yet. The late afternoon sun caught in his eyes for a moment, turning them a pale, almost reflective blue, and for just an instant, Brooks felt a flicker of something he could not name, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, like standing next to something much larger than it appeared. Hayes took the silence as an opening, stepping closer again, his voice dropping slightly. More personal now, less performance. You know what I think, he said. I think you walked in here hoping someone would ask, hoping you could spin a story about a past that sounds better than it was. The words were quieter, but sharper, meant to land deeper, meant to provoke something, anything. Carter finally looked directly at him again, and there was no anger there, no irritation, just that same steady stillness that refused to react the way it should have. You can think whatever you want, Carter said, his voice even. It does not change what it is. The simplicity of it disrupted the rhythm again. No argument, no defense, just a line that did not move. And that was when Brooks made his decision. His thumb slid across his phone screen, unlocking it without looking down, his body turning slightly away from the group as if adjusting his stance. But his attention was already elsewhere. He scrolled quickly, muscle memory guiding him through contacts he had not expected to use today, his heart picking up just enough to notice, not from panic, but from the weight of instinct. He did not call a supervisor, did not call a squad leader. His finger hovered for a fraction of a second over a number labeled simply as command liaison, then pressed. The line began to ring, each tone quiet but sharp in his ear. Behind him, Hayes was still talking, still trying to pull a reaction from Carter, still unaware that the moment had already moved past him. The call connected with a crisp, controlled voice. Liaison office. Brooks kept his voice low, steady. This is Corporal Brooks, Fort Ridgeline. I need to verify something. There was a pause on the other end, brief but attentive. Go ahead. Brooks glanced back at Carter's arm, at the edge of the tattoo just visible beneath the sleeve, then spoke carefully. Circular insignia, single-centered star, no external markings, looks aged, possibly hand-done. Another pause. Longer this time, not confusion, not dismissal, something else. The voice on the other end returned, quieter now. Repeat that description. Brooks did, slower this time, more precise, and as he finished, the silence that followed stretched just a little too long to be routine. Stand by, the voice said, and the line did not disconnect. It simply went quiet, and across the yard, inside the operations building, a door that was usually closed opened without hesitation. The silence on the line did not feel like confusion. It felt like recognition held back, controlled, as if someone on the other end had just stepped into a memory they were not expecting to revisit. Brooks kept the phone close to his ear, his posture still angled away from the group, eyes flicking once more toward Carter, who had not moved, not reacted, not even glanced in his direction, as if the call had nothing to do with him, as if everything unfolding was already known. Behind Brooks, the conversation had not stopped, but it had changed. The laughter was thinner now, less certain. Hayes could feel it slipping, even if he did not fully understand why, and that made him push harder. You know what the real problem is? He said, his voice rising just enough to pull the attention back. Guys like you walk in here and expect respect just because you are old, like time alone earns you something. He paced half a step to the side, keeping Carter in front of him, maintaining that invisible line of control. But out here, respect comes from what you have done, not what you say you did. The statement landed with the confidence of doctrine, something drilled, something repeated, and for a moment it seemed to steady the group again. Carter's gaze remained on him, steady, unchanged, but there was something else now, something quieter, not tension, Not resistance, just a kind of distance. Like he was no longer standing in the same moment as everyone else, like part of him had already stepped somewhere else. Hayes noticed it, just barely, and misread it completely, taking it as dismissal, as indifference, and that irritated him more than any argument could have. "You do not even want to explain it, do you?" he said, stepping closer again, lowering his voice. "Because you know it falls apart if anyone looks too close." Carter shook his head once, slow, not in disagreement, but in correction. "No," he said quietly. "Because it does not need explaining." The words did not challenge. They ended the line of questioning entirely. And that, more than anything, broke the rhythm Hayes had been trying to maintain. Before he could respond, Brooks felt the line in his ear come back to life. A different voice now. Deeper, more measured. "Corporal, who else is present?" Brooks straightened slightly, instinct taking over. Multiple Rangers, one civilian male, late 70s or early 80s, identifying mark matches description. There was a pause, shorter this time, followed by a question that did not sound like a routine check. "Is the individual cooperative?" Brooks glanced back again, watching Carter stand there, calm, still, completely unbothered by the scrutiny around him. "Yes, sir," he answered, and then the voice on the other end went quiet for a single beat before speaking again, slower now, each word deliberate. "Do not escalate the situation. Maintain position." Brooks felt his grip tighten slightly around the phone. "Sir?" he asked. But the line did not give him clarification, only one more instruction, softer, but heavier. "Stay where you are." And then the connection shifted again, not disconnected, just transferred. The faint sound of movement and distant voices bleeding through. Brooks lowered the phone just slightly, his heart picking up again, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was beginning to understand. This was not a verification anymore. This was something moving up, something climbing fast through levels that did not usually respond this quickly. Behind him, Hayes exhaled sharply, frustration finally breaking through. "You know what?" he said, stepping back half a pace, throwing his hands out slightly. "We are done here." He turned to the others, forcing a grin that did not quite settle. "Guy wants to keep his secrets. Let him." A few of the Rangers nodded, some shrugging, the tension easing just enough to let them disengage, but none of them fully turned away, not completely, because something in the air had not reset. Something was still building, still unresolved, and across the yard. The main doors of the operations building opened wider, too. Uniformed officers stepping out first, scanning, followed by a third figure who did not hurry, did not hesitate, and did not need to. The movement across the yard did not announce itself with noise. It announced itself with absence. Conversations thinned, heads turned without knowing why, and a line of attention slowly shifted toward the operations building as the three figures advanced with measured pace. The first two officers scanning instinctively, their posture alert but restrained, while the third walked with a stillness that carried more weight than urgency ever could. General Robert Kane did not rush, did not gesture, did not need to. His presence alone adjusted the space around him. Brooks saw him first and felt his spine straighten without conscious thought. The phone still in his hand, now silent, but no longer needed. Hayes followed the shift a second later, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the direction of everyone else's attention, confusion flickering briefly before recognition began to form, not of what was happening, but of who was approaching, and that alone was enough to pull the confidence out of his stance, not completely, but enough to fracture it. "What is this?" one of the Rangers muttered under his breath, but no one answered, because no one knew. Carter did not turn immediately. He remained where he was, facing Hayes, as if the rest of the world could wait, and for a moment it did. The sound of boots on concrete grew clearer, steady, unhurried, closing the distance in a way that made time feel slightly off, like everything was aligning toward a point that had already been decided. Hayes shifted his weight, glancing back again, this time fully, and when he saw the general clearly, his posture snapped straighter by instinct, his expression tightening as he tried to understand why a man of that rank was walking directly toward this moment, toward this small gathering that had no reason to matter. "Sir," Hayes started, his voice catching just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. But the word did not carry, not fully, because General Kane did not look at him. Not yet. His gaze moved past the Rangers, past the recruits, settling on Carter with a focus that was immediate and absolute. Like finding something long lost in a room full of distractions, the distance between them closed to a few yards before Carter finally turned, not in surprise, not in reaction, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who had already felt the shift coming. Their eyes met, and for a fraction of a second, nothing else existed in that space. No rank, no crowd, no noise, just recognition, not of faces exactly, but of something deeper, something carried through years that had never fully left. Hayes felt it without understanding it. The way the air seemed to tighten, the way even the smallest movements around him slowed. He glanced between them, trying to piece together what he was missing. "General," he said again, louder this time, stepping slightly forward as protocol demanded. But still, Kane did not respond, not verbally. His eyes dropped, not to Carter's face, but to his arm, to the place where the sleeve had fallen back just enough to reveal the edge of the faded ink. And something in the general's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would register to someone who did not know what to look for, but Brooks saw it, a stillness that was different from before, deeper, heavier, as if a memory had just surfaced fully formed. Hayes followed his gaze, looking at the tattoo again, then back at the general. Confusion now unmistakable. "Sir, this individual is," he began, but the sentence did not finish, because Kane lifted one hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to stop the words before they could settle, and in that simple gesture, the entire dynamic shifted, not loudly, not forcefully, but completely, and for the first time since the moment began, Hayes realized he was no longer in control of it at all. The raised hand did not demand silence. It created it, not through authority alone, but through certainty, the kind that leaves no room for interruption. And as Hayes stopped mid-sentence, the weight of that gesture settled across the group like a line drawn in place. General Kane took one more step forward, closing the last few feet between himself and Carter, his eyes never leaving the faded ink now partially visible beneath the sleeve. The late afternoon light catching the worn edges of the symbol, revealing details that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. The slight unevenness of the circle, the star not perfectly symmetrical, not because it was careless, but because it had been done without the need for precision tools, done by hand, by memory, by necessity. Kane's gaze lingered there for a moment longer, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached up and rolled back the cuff of his own uniform sleeve. The motion unhurried, almost deliberate in its simplicity, as if he understood that what came next did not require explanation, only confirmation. Fabric folded back, revealing his forearm, marked not with decoration, not with regulation insignia, but with the same symbol, the same circle, the same centered star, aged differently but unmistakably identical. And in that instant, the space shifted completely, not with sound, not with movement, but with realization. Hayes stared, his eyes moving from Carter's arm to the general's and back again, the confidence that had anchored him just moments ago slipping away without resistance, replaced by something he had not prepared for, something he could not categorize within the rules he understood. One of the rangers beside him took a small step back without realizing it. The subtle scrape of his boot against the concrete loud in the sudden quiet. Brooks felt his breath slow, not from relief, but from the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect, that this was not a misunderstanding, not a coincidence. This was something real, something buried, now standing in plain sight. General Kane did not look at the others, did not acknowledge the crowd that had formed. His focus remained on Carter, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying without force. "I have not seen that mark in over 40 years, he said, the words steady, but weighted with something deeper than memory. Carter's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, not surprise, not pride, just recognition returned. "It was not meant to be seen," he replied quietly, and Kane gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in understanding, a shared acknowledgement of something that existed outside the present moment. Hayes swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry, his voice finding its way out despite the tightening in his chest. "Sir, I did not realize," he began, but again, Kane lifted his hand slightly, not dismissive, not harsh, just enough to stop the explanation before it formed. And this time, Hayes did not try to continue, because he understood now that whatever he had been about to say did not matter here, not in this moment, not in front of what he was beginning to see. Kane's gaze finally shifted, just briefly, sweeping across the Rangers, not accusatory, not angry, but measured, taking in their posture, their expressions, the remnants of a situation that had already passed its turning point. And then his attention returned to Carter, his voice quieter now, almost personal. "We thought that unit was gone," he said, and for the first time, there was something in his tone that hinted at something more than command, something closer to respect. Carter looked down at the tattoo once more, then back at Kane, his answer simple, but final. "Most of it is," he said, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was understood. The words settled without echo, without reaction, but they did not fade. They deepened, like something pressed into the ground instead of carried away, and for a long moment no one moved. Not Hayes, not the Rangers, not even the recruits who had gathered at the edge of the scene, because the moment no longer belonged to them. It belonged to something older, something they had just stepped into without understanding it. General Kane stood there, his sleeves still rolled back, the mirrored symbol visible in the same light. And for a brief second it was impossible to tell which mark had come first, which story had shaped the other, because they were not separate, they were connected by something that did not need explanation. Hayes finally lowered his gaze, not out of discipline, but because he no longer knew where to place it. The certainty that had carried him through the encounter now replaced by a quiet awareness that he had misjudged something fundamental, something he had not even known to look for. One of the Rangers behind him shifted again, this time more noticeably, the tension in his posture giving way to something closer to restraint, like a line had been crossed, and they were only now realizing where it had been. Brooks remained still, his phone now lowered completely, forgotten at his side, his attention fixed on the exchange unfolding in front of him, absorbing every detail, every pause, every word that was not being said, because those carried as much weight as the ones that were. Kane exhaled slowly, the movement subtle but visible, as if releasing something held for longer than this moment alone. His gaze remained on Carter, but there was a shift now, not in recognition, but in acknowledgment. "We closed the files," he said quietly, not to the crowd, not even fully to Carter, but into the space between them. No records, no confirmations, nothing left that could point back. The statement was not defensive, not apologetic. It was factual, the kind of truth that comes from decisions made far above and long before. Carter nodded once, a small movement, understanding without surprise. "That was the idea," he replied, his voice steady, unchanged, as if the erasure had always been part of the mission, part of the agreement. Hayes felt the words settled differently now, not as information, but as context, the realization that what he had dismissed as a story had been something deliberately buried, something designed to disappear, and that made his earlier confidence feel smaller, narrower than it had just minutes ago. Kane's eyes shifted briefly again, this time not scanning, but acknowledging the presence of the others, the Rangers, the recruits, Brooks, each one now part of a moment they had not been meant to witness. "There are things," Kane said, his voice carrying just enough to reach them all, "that are not meant to be explained in full, not because they are unclear, but because they were never meant to remain." The statement was not a warning, not exactly, but it carried weight all the same, a reminder of boundaries that still existed even when crossed. Carter's gaze moved once more across the group, not lingering, not judging, just passing over them like a quiet acknowledgment of their presence, their youth, their certainty, and the way both could change in a single moment. Hayes straightened again, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect now. Unspoken but unmistakable, his voice lower when he spoke, stripped of the earlier edge. "Sir, I was out of line," he said, the words simple, but not easy, and Kane did not respond immediately, his attention still on Carter, because the apology, while necessary, was not the center of this moment. It was only a consequence of it, and Carter did not answer Hayes either, did not accept or reject the words. He simply stood there, as he had from the beginning, unchanged, as if the moment had never been about correction at all, but about something else entirely. something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The apology did not hang in the air for long, not because it was dismissed, but because it was no longer the center of gravity. The moment had already moved past it, and everyone present could feel that shift without needing it explained. General Kane let the silence sit for another second, then slowly lowered his sleeve, covering the symbol again, not as if hiding it, but as if returning it to where it belonged, unseen, unspoken. His posture remained steady, but there was a quiet finality in the gesture, like closing a chapter that had briefly reopened. He looked at Carter again, and this time there was something more visible in his expression, not just recognition, but respect carried without performance. "We wrote them down," Kane said quietly, his voice no longer carrying to the crowd, meant only for the space between them. "Names, dates, what little we could confirm." Carter listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his breathing even. "But there were gaps," Kane continued, "places where the records just stopped." He paused, not searching for words, but allowing the truth to sit as it was, incomplete by design. Carter gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible. "There always were," he said, and there was no frustration in it, no regret, just acknowledgment, as if the missing pieces had never been expected to return. Brooks watched closely, realizing now that this was not about proving anything, not about revealing a hidden past for validation. It was about two men recognizing the same silence, the same absence that defined something larger than either of them. Hayes remained still, his earlier posture of control replaced by something quieter, more contained, his eyes lowered slightly, not in shame alone, but in understanding that he had stepped into a moment he was never meant to lead. Kane shifted his stance just slightly, turning enough to acknowledge the others without fully breaking the connection with Carter. "Some things are not lost because they are forgotten," he said, his voice steady again, carrying just enough to reach those listening. "They are lost because that is how they were meant to remain." The words settled across the group with a different kind of weight, not correction, not instruction, but perspective. Carter's gaze moved once more across the faces around him, lingering for a brief second on Brooks, not as recognition, but as acknowledgement of the one who had seen the shift early, then back to Kane. "And sometimes," Carter added quietly, "they show up anyway." The faintest hint of something like humor touched the edge of his voice, not enough to change the tone, but enough to mark the moment as something rare. Kane allowed a small breath through his nose, not quite a smile, but something close to it. Then he straightened fully, the weight of command returning without force. "Mr. Carter," he said, using the name with deliberate respect, "you are welcome on this base anytime." The statement was simple, but absolute. Not a gesture, not a courtesy, but recognition formalized. Carter inclined his head slightly, accepting without emphasis. "I appreciate that," he replied, his tone unchanged, as if the acknowledgement was noted, but not necessary, because what mattered had already been understood. The crowd around them began to shift again, slowly, uncertainly, as if released from a moment they had not known how to hold. Conversations did not resume immediately. Movement returned in fragments, small adjustments of posture, quiet glances exchanged. Hayes stepped back half a pace, giving space without being told, his earlier certainty replaced by something that would take longer to define. Brooks exhaled slowly, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath through most of the exchange. The air around them felt different now, not lighter, but settled, as if something that had been out of place had been set back where it belonged, and at the center of it, Carter stood exactly as he had at the beginning, unchanged, unshaken, carrying nothing that needed to be proven. The moment did not end with a command. It ended with stillness, the kind that settles into memory without needing to be marked. General Kane gave a final nod, not formal, not ceremonial, just enough to close what had been opened. Then he stepped back, not turning his back immediately, but allowing the distance to re-establish itself. The officers who had accompanied him remained quiet, their presence now secondary, their attention steady but unobtrusive. Carter did not move right away. He stood for a second longer, as if confirming that nothing more needed to be said, that the recognition had been complete. Then he adjusted his sleeve with a simple motion, covering the tattoo once more, returning it to its place beneath the surface. unseen, unspoken, as it had been for decades. Hayes watched that small movement more closely than anything else, because it carried a finality he could not ignore. The realization settling deeper now, not just that he had been wrong, but that he had never been equipped to understand what he was questioning in the first place. He took a slow breath, straightening again, not out of habit this time, but out of respect that no longer needed to be performed. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice quieter than before, stripped of any edge, and Carter turned his head slightly, acknowledging him without urgency. "Yes, Sergeant," Carter replied, and the simple return of the title, correct, deliberate, carried more weight than any reprimand could have. Hayes held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a small, controlled movement that said everything he did not try to put into words. Carter accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else, without ceremony, without need for confirmation. Then he turned and began to walk, not toward the center of the base, not toward the crowd, but along the edge of the path where he had been standing before, his pace steady, unhurried, blending back into the ordinary space as if he had always belonged there and nowhere else. The people around him shifted, instinctively, not making way in any obvious gesture, but creating space all the same. Conversations remained low, voices measured, as if something in the air still held the weight of what had just occurred. Brooks watched him go, committing the image to memory, not the details of the jacket or the boots, but the way he carried himself, the absence of need, the quiet certainty that did not depend on recognition. Kane remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following Carter just briefly, then returning to the space in front of him, as if resetting the world back into place. He looked at Hayes, not with judgment, not with correction, but with a calm that expected understanding, and Hayes gave a slight nod in return, the lesson already taken, already settling into something he would carry forward long after this moment. The general turned then, walking back toward the operations building with the same measured pace he had arrived with. No urgency, no display, just presence. And as he moved away, the base slowly resumed its rhythm, boots on concrete, distant engines, voices rising again, but not quite the same as before, because something had shifted beneath it all, something quiet and lasting. And long after Carter had disappeared from view, the space where he had stood remained marked not by sound or sign, but by the understanding that some names are never written where others can see them, and some service is never meant to be proven, only remembered, by those who were there, and recognized, when it matters, by the ones who still carry it.